Hello everyone. Our reading today is taken from Matthew chapter 11, reading verses 16 to 19 and then verses 25 to 28. And here is the passage. To what can I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her deeds. At that time Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father. So no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. You know, one of my all-time favourite novels is a novel by Charles Dickens entitled Great Expectations. And one of the things that fascinates me about that novel is the way that it ends. No, don't worry, no need for a spoiler alert. I'm not going to tell you the ending. I'm not one of those people who does things like that, tells you the ends of films and books. I wouldn't do that to anybody else. I remember how upset I was once when I was going to see the film Titanic, and somebody told me how that ended before I got there, so I'm not going to do that to you. Anyway, the thing is about Great Expectations is that it has two endings. It has a happy ending, and it has a sad ending. You know, they say that cynicism is simply idealism that's gone sour. And by the time Charles Dickens came to write Great Expectations, his idealism of his youth certainly turned sour. And now he was a professional cynic. And so he determined that he would make the title Great Expectations ironic, and it would have a sad ending. But he had a best friend named Wilkie Collins, another author, less well known, of course, than Charles Dickens, who wrote The Woman in White. And he persuaded him to change the ending to a happy ending. He said, Charlie boy, your public, devoted, adoring public, they have expectations of their own, and they expect you to provide them with a happy ending. So get to it, stop messing about. So, to please their expectations, he did write a happy ending. And in certain editions, you can read both, the happy ending and the sad. It has to be said, though, that the happy ending lacks any kind of continuity with the novel in any sense of authenticity. But read it for yourself if you haven't already, and you can make up your own mind. But his public, they had great expectations of their own, it turns out. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the need to put texts back into context. And you may remember we did this last week with the word welcome, and we looked at some other places in Matthew chapter 10 where putting the text into context helped us to see something of the symmetry and the pattern behind the passage. But there's more than one kind of context, of course. It's not just a context within the passage. You have your own context. One of my favourite phrases is context is king. So what's your context as you approach this passage today? Because that will certainly have an influence on the way that you approach and interpret passages such as this. So what's your context? Are you a BAME person? Are you someone who's in local lockdown in Leicester, having had your great expectations, if not crushed, at least put on hold? Have you got COVID-19? Have you had it? Are you worried about somebody else with it? What's your context? Because if context is king, it really is going to change your interpretation of this passage. And certainly for all of us, the pandemic is our context. And it has changed our expectations. One of the reasons I mention this is because I think some of the language of Jesus today is reminding us how when our expectations aren't met, it can really not only fill us with disappointment, but other emotions such as anger and resentment. You see this in this passage today. You could just imagine the people saying to each other, can't you? Do you know our Messiah figures just like buses? You wait for one for 400 years and then two contenders for being Messiah turn up at once. John the Baptist and Jesus. But neither of them met the people's expectations of what a Messiah should be. So, for example, you get John the Baptist. He can't be the Messiah. He doesn't meet our expectations. Too austere. And what's all this business of telling us to repent and seek forgiveness? We don't need to repent. We don't need to seek forgiveness. We're the people of God. And as Voltaire would later go on to say, God must forgive. That's his job. And then there's Jesus. Well, he doesn't meet our expectations at all. Far too party going and mixing in the wrong circles for my liking. And because neither of these figures meet the expectations of the people, you get a sense of the mounting anger, frustration and disappointment as Jesus says these very famous words. Well, you know, you're just like kids, aren't you? We play a pipe for you. You won't dance. We sing a dirge for you and you won't mourn. You're just in a sulk. You're just so angry because your expectations of God and his Messiah haven't been realised. But what people sometimes do to God in their expectations of how he should be under their control, how they should be able to predict what God is going to do next, they do to other people too. They have their expectations of others that they're in relationship with, and when they don't live up to their expectations, well, they're certainly going to know about it. Either they'll get the rage and the outburst, the flouncing out of the room and the slamming of the doors, or they'll get the cold, silent treatment for a long time while the other person goes into a sulk. And simply because they've placed too heavy a yoke of expectations upon that other person in relationship, whether it's God, whether it's the other person, whether it's themselves actually. And when they can't control and predict through the expectations, as I say, anger or sulking are two of the options that they have available to them in their arsenal. I wonder if when Jesus says this famous verse from our passage today, he might have been thinking about the heavy weight that other people's expectations place upon us. Just remind you of the text, if I may. So Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Here we go. "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." In his day, of course, the heavy burden that was being placed on the shoulders of the people were the expectations of the Pharisees, and you could never live up to them. So the yoke just got heavier and heavier. But Jesus swaps the word expectation with a word that's far more vital and dynamic, and it's the word expectancy. So he's saying, are you really struggling under the heavy burden of the weight that people put on your shoulders through their unreasonable expectations of you? Well, come to me, because I have a yoke for you that is so much lighter. And it's not my expectations of you, it's the expectancy that I have in my heart whenever I look at your life. You know, there are a few books that have changed the hard wiring of my thinking over the years. And one of them is a book by William P. Young entitled The Shack. Many of you might have read that book for yourself. There's a couple of things in there that have rewired my thinking, changed my entire approach and attitude to other people and to life. But one of the things that he taught me was the difference between expectation and expectancy. Especially expectations are based on a sort of, well, I've scratched your back, so you better scratch my back mentality. I've done this for you, so you owe me big time. Or that kind of power and controlling kind of back scratching mentality that simply sucks the life out of relationships and kills them. As opposed to a more vital and vibrant word, expectancy. The expectancy in relationships that is open to the other person, attentive to the other person, alive to the other person, and simply just wondering what kind of gift of love is going to come out of this next. Difference between expectations based on a reciprocal nature of things, the expectancy of gift. When I was thinking about these things, I came across the testimony of a woman who spoke about how this kind of expectation in relationships had really spoilt her life, made her so miserable and made everybody else miserable around her. I can't really do better than read the testimony to you, really. It's not very long. I'll try and read it so that you can get a handle on it. But this is this woman's testimony when she speaks about the difference between the expectations, the kind of which we've been speaking, and expectancy in relationships. So here's the testimony. She said, I live my life based on expectations, expecting others, myself and God to behave in whatever particular way I deemed as good or reasonable. And when they didn't live up to it, I would be hurt, disappointed, angry, or all of the above. Not only would I be chagrined in that moment of offence, but I would hold on to the grudge, letting one resentment pile on top of the other. And then she goes on to talk about how things changed when she read The Shack. And like me, it taught her the difference between expectations based on mutual back scratching and the expectancy, which I guess is based on gift. So she goes on to say, instead of experiencing the pain and frustration of my husband and my friends not treating me in the way that I felt they ought to, I began to experience the contentment, satisfaction and freedom of receiving their love in whatever way they most enjoyed expressing it. When we let go of our terms and conditions, guidelines, ultimatums and control, in other words, our expectations, and we replace them with a simple, childlike expectancy, we will frequently find ourselves, as C.S. Lewis puts it, surprised by joy. And really, isn't that the only way to experience joy? Through surprise. If you still can't get a handle on it, this difference between that kind of expectation and expectancy, then just ask yourself how you feel when you tune in on a Sunday morning. It might be, of course, that experience has taught you that you simply expect to be bored. But what I hope for you is that as you sit down, turn on the screen, you have a sense of expectancy. And if you have that expectancy, then you'll know what I'm talking about. If you still haven't got a handle on it, let me just tell you this little story that I've always loved about a young boy who was very sick in hospital, on the children's ward, and nothing that the nurses did were making anything any better, and every day he was just getting worse. And into this awful situation, they sent a rookie school teacher to try and teach the boy his times table. And she was a novice, she was new, she'd never taught in a hospital before, never had to cope with a sick child in the way that she was having to do now. She was really nervous and tentative, but nevertheless she plucked up her courage and she sat by the boy's bed. She opened the times tables and she started to teach him. And then she set him some homework saying, when I come next week, I'd like you to have learned, for example, 3 times table. That night she felt very depressed and out of sorts. She didn't really feel that she had achieved very much and could possibly conceive of how a child with no expectations at all, that as that boy did, could be interested in his times table. The next morning, or the next week rather, she went back onto the ward, and before she could almost set 2 steps into the place, the nurse had pulled her onto one side and said, "What have you done to that boy?" Well, she went white with shock and she started to stammer and she said, I don't know. I don't know what you mean. What do you mean? What have I done to the boy? And the nurse mellowed and she said, well, ever since you were here this last week, we've had a complete reversal. Everything's changed. Every day the boy is getting stronger and healthier and fitter. We're just wondering, what on earth did you do? When the boy was able to articulate things for himself, what he said was, well, the thing is, all I'd experienced to this point were people speaking in low voices about me rather than to me. The worried look on their faces and the way that they spoke to me with such pity made me realise that they had only one expectation of me, and that's that I was going to die. But you came in last week teaching me the times table. And it made me realise when I thought about it, hold on a minute, if she thinks it's worth teaching me my times table, she must have an expectancy about me, that I'm actually going to live long enough to put these times tables to use. And that's when I realised that I was going to live. The expectations of other people had literally been sucking the life out of that boy. The expectancy of the school teacher literally brought the vitality, the life, the hope, the vibrancy back into his life, made him want to play his pipes and dance a merry jig. So how about you? What's your context? Are you a mutual scratch backing expectations type of person? Not only wearing a heavy yoke for yourself, but making sure that other people do too. Have you come to Jesus? Have you allowed him to place the light yoke of expectancy upon your shoulders? Has he surprised you with the joy that he brings? Is that joy infectious to other people in your life? During this week, you can set yourself the project you like of trying to work out whether you're an expectations or expectancy kind of person. For example, here's the test for the expectations. whether it's in your relationship with God, other people, or yourself, just catch yourself every time you say words such as these: should, ought, must. Those are red alert words. They're words that say there's a real danger. They're sucking the life out of things by using expectation type words. Expectancy one, here's a few examples. If you catch yourself saying something such as, "You fancy, he only stayed an hour." Or if you find yourself catching yourself saying such as thing as, can you believe it? Time is such a precious commodity. And he gave me an hour of his time. What a wonderful gift. If you catch yourself saying things such as, "Do you know, I'll cook that meal for him and he couldn't even be bothered to dry up after washing up." Or you might catch yourself saying, "Do you know, I'll cook that meal out of love for him. Do you know how he expressed his love for me? He washed up." There you go, a little project for the week. Just to detect whether you're wearing the heavy yoke yourself or placing it on other people. This mutual back scratching kind of expectations thing. Whether the expectancy of the light yoke that Jesus wants you to wear, setting you on fire, bringing you life, spreading the joy to all the people that you meet in your context.